Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva. Kadesh, Yameinu Kekedah. Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva, Kadesh, Kadesh, Yameinu Kekedah. Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva, Kadesh, Kadesh, Yameinu Kekedah. Kadesh, Kadesh, Yameinu Kekedah. Hello, friends. Welcome to our third session of On Repentance and Repair. It's good to be with you all virtually this evening, and happy Tu B'Shvat. Nice few of you I saw in person a few minutes ago, and I'm getting to see online again. It's very nice. So this week we are exploring the public apology. The public apology for the public wrong. And there's different iterations of this, which are discussed in Rabbi Ruttenberg's book. Sometimes a person causes harm to one other person, but it's in front of many people. And so the teshuvah has to be in front of many people. There's an example story that I learned from my husband from the yeshiva world of a rabbi who shamed a student in class, told the student asked a question, and the rabbi said, "This question is ridiculous." And then the student didn't come to the next session of the class, and the rabbi realized, oh, I really hurt the student's feelings. So the rabbi said, okay, class, you all need to come with me. And he walked all of the students with him to the other students' dorm room and said, I embarrassed you in front of all these other students, made the whole class feel less safe. So I need to apologize to you in front of all these students. So that's the individual harm to an individual in public. There is the harm that an individual causes that may be specifically caused to another individual, but the person causing the harm is such a public persona that when it comes to light, it has cultural implications, it has cultural impacts, other people feel harmed by it. That's hashtag me too, right? That's men in power abusing, harassing individual women, and yet the impact when that, when someone like Louis C.K. does or does not do teshuva, it's important that it be not just in private, but to all who are impacted by hearing the story of the harm done. And then there is the harm done publicly, right? The person who posts bigoted things online doesn't have a particular target, particular individual target, but is putting out content into the world that hurts people in a public way, and therefore to do teshuva, the teshuva has to involve some sort of public showing of remorse and penitence and amends making. So thanks to Janine, who sent me earlier this week a story of public apology. I am going to just summarize it, but it's a story. I mean, I can scroll it a little bit to share with you. From, is this the London Times, I believe? From after the death of Princess Diana.
It's in the New
Apparently,
York Times.
what?
New York
Oh, it's
Times.
from the New York Times. Okay. Apparently, after the death of Princess Diana, Queen Elizabeth was widely criticized for being cold and distant about Diana's death, and so she made a public appearance to mourn Diana and to speak from the heart about the family's grief. Now, it's interesting because reading the article, it doesn't seem like she apologized for her distance, but she did explain her distance and try to undo the distance and get close to the people. And I wonder, Janine, if you want to share more, or if anyone who was not 12 years old at the time, as I was, and who was paying a little more attention to the news, would like to express more what it meant for Queen Elizabeth after all of the conflict and I want to say the term bad blood, although it seems like an inappropriate phrase for some reason to me, but that had existed between the royal family and Princess Diana, what it meant for the Queen to publicly show up and express grief. Sure, Marcia. You're muted. You're muted.
I wasn't 12.
Okay, great.
The relationship, well, let me back up. Queen Elizabeth was brought up to keep everything within the family, and grief especially was a private thing. And so even though there was some bad blood, and there was, it was more for her about just keeping everything private. But because the people loved Diana so much, they were not going to accept that the Queen was not going to express some emotion. So Tony Blair, who was the prime minister at the time, kept talking to the Queen and saying, "You got to do this," and she's like, "I think not." And it was hard for her, is all I'm trying to say. And it was
So
a
that's
generation.
actually, that's a beautiful observation, right? Like sometimes the thing that we're doing that causes harm is something that is deeply conditioned in us.
Yes.
Something, in fact, that we have been taught is the appropriate way to behave. And in order to do amends making, we have to recognize that the conditioning is not serving, is causing hurt. And then we have to actively work against that conditioning, which can be extraordinarily uncomfortable in order to meet others.
Yeah, she was actually shocked and hurt by the people's reaction to what she had always done and had been reared from birth to do. And this was the first time the people had not understood her. And it was really painful for her. So, I mean, most people entirely take Diana's perspective on this, but you know, I'm old enough to have a bit of a different understanding of Elizabeth's position.
Thank you, Marcia. So, I mean, I think like probably when I first read this, I was like, this is kind of a funny example, but I think there's a lot to work with here. And so I really appreciate that. It is painful sometimes doing the work, we feel hurt when we're called out. We feel hurt when we're told that our behavior is hurtful. We feel hurt when we're told that our behavior is hurtful in the public sphere, right? Like from Queen Elizabeth's perspective, probably and very reasonably, she would have felt like, what do the people have to do with this? Yes, Diana and I did not get along. Maybe I hurt Diana. But what business does the British public have feeling angry at me, feeling hurt by me about this? That is the burden of acting in the public sphere, is that our impacts, that our actions have impacts beyond just the specific impacts we maybe intend to have. So lots to unpack there. I'm going to move on to the next person. Thank you, Marcia. And Ken.
I just think of how many times I've met someone that seems like they were treated abusively by someone, often someone they're in a relationship. One of the first things I say to the person is, do not expect an apology. That's going to be their choice. Go on with your life. Don't expect an apology. I think the British public was not so much demanding, from my memory, that they get something, but they were just expressing their grief, deeply expressing their grief. And I don't think they expected, based on their history and the Queen's history, I don't think they expected an apology from the Queen. So, but it relieved them so much that their grief was being acknowledged. So I don't think the Queen could have done any better than this. It clearly came off as an apology to the people and relieved many people that deeply loved Diane.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. So yeah, this is another piece about the ways that sometimes a well done expression of public penitence can be very validating for the people who are hurting. Janine, go ahead.
I think this was a turning point for the royal family, in that following this experience, they were much more publicly engaged. They knew that the people needed to be acknowledged, and that things like the Queen shakes thousands of people's hands. But for each individual person, that's the one time they might shake a hand with her. So she started to make eye contact and interacted in a different way. So I think there was an ongoing change that took place between her and the rest of the royal family and the public.
Awesome. Right. And that's an example of how, if you make an apology and you mean it, it's not just going to change that moment. It's going to transform who you are for the long term. Okay, awesome. So much to unpack with it. I would never have guessed that the example of public apology that would give us a lot to unpack would be the Queen of England after the death of Princess Diana. But what a great example. I haven't looked at this in advance, but let's watch the video that Carrie put in the chat now. Carrie, how long is this video?
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing video, but it's 8 minutes long, so it might not be appropriate, but it's what I show my students when we talk about how to call people in and how to apologize while taking responsibility for your actions.
Okay.
It's kind of amazing.
Right, friends, what do you think? Watch it and be a little multimedia? Yeah. All right, let's watch it. Give me a moment and I will share computer sound. Oh, wait, why? It's not giving me.
Maybe Carrie can share it if you give her the right.
I'm happy to make Carrie co-host. I'm just not sure. Usually when I go to screen share, it gives me the option to click on share computer sound, but right now it's not giving me that option. But maybe Carrie, if I make you co-host and you screen share, it will give you that option. Let's try.
Nope, it doesn't give me that option. So I wonder if it's because it's closed captions are being generated, or there's something that we have that somehow we can't share sound.
All right, so what I'm going to do is play this without, because I can't click on that, and then see if you just can't hear, like, interrupt and tell me, and we will do this without, and we have to wait through the Liberty Mutual ad. Sorry.
You can share, you can skip screen pretty quickly.
Okay, can we hear?
Nope.
No.
No. Okay. All
Can we
right, friends.
take off closed captioning?
I don't think it's because of the closed captioning, because
Okay.
usually when I go to share screen, I have whatever that option comes up right away. So let's not spend more time on tech right now. Carrie, you'll send me this link and I'll distribute it to the class and the class notes. Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording in case anyone wants to share something about public apology that they don't want in the public record. So give me a moment. So we've just started to go into this issue of calling in versus calling out, right? To what extent is it useful? To what extent is it harmful for publicly calling out individuals when they cause harm? Versus, like, how much do we need the caring and trust and the sort of empathically sidling up to someone, rather literally, physically, or like metaphorically just getting in close to someone and saying, I love you and I see it from your perspective and here's how you weren't quite right, which this book calls calling in. And someone just mentioned the example of Derek Black, which is a really interesting example because in telling the story, Derek Black himself says that both the calling out and the calling in were necessary for his process of penitence, right? These students who kept inviting him to Shabbat dinner in part made such an impact on him because the rest of campus was shunning him and was making him feel shame and was making it really clear who you are is not okay. And the power of the acceptance of those few who did keep inviting him to Shabbat dinner only was so powerful in contrast to the calling out he was experiencing. So there is a necessity for both in the discourse, but it can be really hard. It can be hard to receive it, and it can be hard in the moment to know what is the right strategy for seeking teshuva. I'm going to call on Jessica and I'm going to call on Anne, and then we're going to go into discussion on this topic. Go ahead, Jessica.
Okay. a couple of you like Carrie and stuff had mentioned, kind of triggered some thoughts for me. In my role at the VA, I'm the LGBTQ plus veterans care coordinator and the special emphasis program manager for employees, for LGBTQ plus employees. And so I work and I also work in sterile processing. And one of my coworkers had started making fun of and picking at a veteran for having an orchectomy surgery, which is to remove, the testicles for hormone management. And was like, making fun of this veteran and saying like, oh, I bet they're really gonna hurt and all of that. And just really off-colored comments. And I walked up and I said, she has made this decision. We don't know why she made this decision. It's none of our business. Our job is to clean the instruments and make sure they're sterile for that surgery. So by you disrespecting this veteran by using the incorrect pronouns and making assumptions for care, medical treatment that they have chosen, I said, it's not okay. It's not okay to say these things, make these assumptions, and talk about somebody this way. I was like, how would you like it if they were picking at you or making fun of you for, your service connected, disabilities and stuff? And he just kind of like was just blown away that I actually called him out on it and kind of in front of everybody. But I was just like, stop in line. I'm like, no, this is unacceptable. And I'm not going to stand here and listen to you belittle this person because of their healthcare choices. And so later he ended up coming up to me and apologizing because, he's like, buddy, I just got to tell you, I'm really sorry, but I don't understand all of these things, like the pronouns and, people being transgender and stuff. I just don't get it. So I'm more than willing to like talk to you about it and, give you education on it. I said, I'm totally cool with that. I said, I'm not going to stand around and listen to you disrespect people based on, their gender identity and how they want to live their life. And so kind of like was called him out instead of calling him in, but it was just kind of what everybody said kind of made me think of that. So
and sometimes that is what is needed.
Yeah.
Sometimes people don't respond to gentle
critique.
subtextual critique.
Working with military people, there's no gentle.
Anne?
Yes, I just wanted to clarify the word trust. I feel like to me, it's not, you use the word sidling. It's not that. It's much deeper than that. And so it just is it's a value that I hold personally and see the transformative power of that value. And also how we have to have the wisdom of discernment as we're going through all of this. For me, looking at oneself before eagerly go, I know what I was gonna say. Also, the guy, Black, his harm is so egregious. And so there's such a continuum of harm. And to just dump everything into harm instead of looking at, oh, I'm done with that, or it takes me 5 years to process it so I can really transform. I think there's just so many nuances of what harm is and what needs to be addressed. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And I apologize if you felt like your comment was dismissed by my use of the word sidling. I more meant like sometimes we need to get close to people to show them that we're in that we're in it with them, right? We can't encourage them to do the work by holding from a distance. Yeah, so, and you're coming about different layers of harm, so true. And in that respect, I really recommend, it's a little booklet by Adrian. You got muted. Sorry. This little booklet by Adrienne Marie Brown, which I think I also mentioned in the Rosh Hashanah and the Yom Kippur speech, in which I talked about this book too. We Will Not Cancel Us. And she just talks about like the ways that progressive communities especially can kind of tear each other apart over small harms, and the policing of ideological purity, the policing of purity of behavior, and the importance of sticking with each other through harms, especially when they are not egregious, when they are correctable, and remembering that harm is correctable. Almost the vast majority of harms are correctable. So this is what we are going to focus on for my first discussion question. It is, if you've got the book, we're going to the bottom of page 81, the quote, the paragraph beginning with Maimonides is adamant, and reading to the bottom of page 83. There is a time and a place for public rebuke. So I encourage you in small groups to read this. Either if you all have the book, you can scan it to yourselves, or if some of you don't have access to the book, maybe you can take time to read it out loud together. And then you're going to discuss the question, what is challenging? What are the limitations of calling people in privately? What is challenging? What are the limitations about calling people out publicly? What feels clear or unclear about whether feedback and which kind is called for in which contexts? So I'm putting all that instruction in the chat. And then I'm going to send you into breakout rooms. Does that sound good? Oops, I accidentally put it in the chat twice. But it's there. So bottom of page 81 to the end of page 83. Okay. We just lost somebody. We just lost two people. All right. I'm going to give you guys 15 minutes and then I'll pull you back in here. Welcome back, everyone. Did anyone have insights from your group that you want to publicly share for the public record? Challenges and distinctions of when we need to offer public reproof, when we need to call in gently. Yes, Carrie, go ahead. And then Annette.
We had a great conversation, and I'm not going to bring up a specific example, but it really highlighted the fact of, I think, two levels. One, how calling someone in publicly, like saying something publicly, it's so important or so helpful to be mindful of the shame you might be causing the individual person, and how the passage that we read highlighted some of the benefits of calling that person in privately first in order to do that. But the flip of that was us talking about how it actually sometimes is super important to say something publicly, because when someone says something publicly that is sending a harmful message and we don't say anything, in some ways we're condoning that message or keeping that message in people's heads. And that creates our reality, it creates our social norm. And so there is a part publicly where it's our responsibility to say something, not just privately, but actually to come back in the moment and say something right then. But then the responsibility to not completely shame the person who said it so that they're cut off from the community and any growth. So it was tricky, but it had led to a great conversation.
Right. The ways, especially when there's some power dynamic or structural oppression at play. Rabbi Ruttenberg talks about, like, if someone is saying something racist and you don't speak out in the moment, what that means for how you're participating in racism. I actually, that reminds me of another moment from my own life several years ago, 2017, I think, when it was the Movement for Black Lives published their policy platform. And it's an amazing platform, so much that was wonderful. And in two paragraphs of the document, there were some incendiary statements, at the time, very incendiary statements about Israel that made many Jewish communal institutions extremely reactive to it and have extremely condemnatory responses. And I was in a different city and was being hosted by a colleague, a rabbi in that city, who said, I was so angry. I had this Black Lives Matter sign out, and then they published this, and I just had to take my Black Lives Matter sign down. And it took me years to call up that colleague. It wasn't until years later, when I was doing a Me and White Supremacy book group, and got to the chapter on white silence, that I called up that colleague and said, you know, when you said that, I should have said in the moment, Black lives don't stop mattering just when some Black people say something you disagree with. And I'm sorry I didn't say that to you sooner. I should have said it then, but I'm saying it to you now. So what do you think about that? And then we had a really good conversation, but I still, like, there's no undoing the fact that I didn't say that in the moment. Someone else had a hand up. Noah, go ahead.
I was just thinking as you were speaking and having listened to a couple of the people and knowing the inside of my own head, how we carry with us our silence or our speaking. And I brought up in our group times that I've blown the whistle, or let's just look at Snowden. You know, we collectively owe that poor man an apology. He had to become a Russian citizen. I can't even imagine, you know, like that there is those pieces too, but that our responsibility stays with us as our own guilt, our own blessing as we go by. It's not just anymore the person that spoke. It's like all of us are affected by the words when they come out, and we carry that with us a long time, whether we're the ones who said it or whether we were quiet. And I think that's an amazing power that words have.
Mhm. Yeah, someone in one of the breakout groups talked about the idea of rebuke and being resistant to the notion of the concept of tochacha, of rebuking people. And that the notion of rebuke has a punitive connotation of, like, sort of abusive language, you know, you idiot. So I just want to be clear, like, from Jewish tradition, there are laws of tochacha, hilchot tochacha, and of how to do rebuke, because it is a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to offer reproof, and one of the laws of tochacha is you do it as privately as possible, and you do it as gently as possible, and you only start to escalate it by being more firm and more public as the harm escalates or the refusal of penitence escalates. But those who would want to call others out or in, according to Jewish tradition, do have an obligation to do it as much as possible in a way that does not trigger shame or defensiveness. Yes, Julie.
I have confusion about the rebuking, especially when I'm looking at, like, Maimonides language or religious language about calling out somebody for sin in your community, because and then just examples that I've heard sort of in ultra-Orthodox communities of people rebuking each other for being sinful. I think, who's keeping it clean about if you're right? when you rebuke somebody, that's your point of view. You know, like the examples in the book are all very clear about, you know, like calling out racism or, but I'm just thinking about like in a community where the majority of that community thinks that something is sinful and rebuke that person for being sinful. Outside that community, you might think, well, that's not sinful. That's a person's right to do that. You know, whatever, you know what I'm saying, and maybe around homosexuality or whatever, you know, I'm a little nervous about this, that there's clarity about what is right and who gets to be the arbiter of whether that rebuke is appropriate.
So I want to say yes to your question. I think yes, there's the clarity is always gonna break down in moments of values clash. And values clash are really likely at the places where different cultures meet. We talked about this a little bit last week around someone in class talking about, you know, a family member who who thought that their family was harmful in the world, and right, and the harm that causes. And so maybe this doesn't work across cultures. Maybe this doesn't work. We can't be both morally relativist the way that we like to be as postmodern, westernized, progressive American Jews, and have moral clarity about something being wrong and needing reproof. And I guess I would say there's probably still enough cases where this is useful to us for it to be worth studying. I don't know if that's a useful answer, Julie.
Yeah, I mean, I'll think about it. It just makes me nervous, you know,
Mhm.
that, and, you know, even like within a culture, you know, the culture decides something is sinful and,
Right.
in another 20 years, it won't be, but right then they say it is. And so somebody is reproved for that behavior or attitude or something. So I mean, this is always my struggle. It's like for clarity about, uh, you know, I don't know.
So I
So
think the language of sin is problematic. I think if we can stick to the language of harm, perhaps we can
yeah,
keep
but
to clarity.
there's that harm to the community. Like, you're harming our community because you're doing this, you know, or you're teaching this, or you're exposing children to
Right.
this, or whatever.
Well, I think if the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox in Mea Sharim, would say that to people who came driving through their community accidentally on Shabbat, instead of throwing stones at them, that would be very helpful. Right?
Yeah.
Like driving on Shabbat is a sin, right, in the traditional Jewish framework. However, your feelings about the loadedness of the word sin, it is forbidden by halacha. It is not harmful in many contexts, but it is harmful in an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem. It's deeply disruptive of the peace of the neighborhood. And I would posit that the ultra-Orthodox Jews who live in that neighborhood have absolutely the right to give tochacha, to give rebuke to anyone who would come driving through their neighborhood on Shabbat. Now, where it gets murky is the harm they cause in the ways that they give tochacha, right? Because, you know, going up and getting in front of a car and stopping the car and saying, you need to get out of here. This is not an okay place to be driving on Shabbat would be one thing. And throwing stones at the car and yelling is not that,
Mm-hmm.
which gets us to, you know, the Jewish obligation to give reproof in the gentlest way possible. Caitlin, go ahead.
Mine was just about when I have a question. So when we're talking about rebuke, it seems like it's all verbal, and that the harm that's being caused is verbal. But then I hear this example of the cars, right? Like I was thinking kind of more systematically of like sex workers forbidden, and the way that our community deals with that is by punishing people and throwing them in jail. And so like what does rebuke look like when it's more than just like, hey, we don't use the word homeless in class, or like J.K. Rowling, stop saying horrible things. What's the next level of rebuke when there's like systems that end up in place because of that? I guess I'm having a hard time framing the question, but that's just like I'm kind of stuck. Like I'm not sure
What
what
are the consequences that we should be communally
yeah.
imposing
Yes.
that are beyond verbal
Right. Yes, thank you. And what
of harms people are causing, whether they are verbal or not? So here's another great example from Jewish tradition that is also very loaded. And I sometimes hesitate to be talking about communities that are not ours. Ours is not an Orthodox Jewish community. So in some ways, we're not talking about ourselves when I talk about Orthodox Judaism. But because we're dealing with a traditional halachic source, I think it's useful to see how these things can play out in communities that take halacha seriously. So in traditional halacha, it is a flaw, it is an acknowledged flaw in traditional halacha. Only a man has the right to initiate and manifest a divorce in a heterosexual relationship. A woman can leave her husband, but she cannot be legally divorced unless he desires it and goes through the process, and she cannot sue for divorce. But because it is an acknowledged flaw, traditionally halachic communities actually have escalations they take to force a man to divorce his wife when the community thinks that the marriage is harmful for the woman and she deserves to get a divorce. And it will start with private, gentle, verbal persuasion. And it will escalate to public consequences. Like I remember when I worked as a Jewish environmental educator, just a really interesting conversation. At one point, I was working with for a few days with a Jewish day school, and one of the with an Orthodox Jewish day school, and one of the chaperones was this woman, was the mom of one of the kids. And I don't remember how we got into this conversation, but she was telling me about when her husband was refusing to give her a divorce. She was telling me this in the context of how amazing her rabbi was, you know, ultra Orthodox male rabbi. And she was like, he was so good to me. He told my husband that he could not have an aliyah and he would not get any honor to the Torah until he gave me a divorce. When he still didn't give me a divorce and he tried to go to another shul, he called the other shuls, he called the other rabbis and said, you cannot let this man have an aliyah. You cannot let him have any leadership in the community because he won't give his wife a divorce. And you know, so like in a morally thick community that takes halacha seriously, there become these, you know, specific communal consequences that we would say like are the consequences of cancellation when there isn't other recourse to correcting that harm. And I mean, and it can escalate further to like people like thugs beating the men up if they still won't. I mean, it's not a good system. It's not a good system, but it is a system where the community is recognizing some harm is being done that we as a community need to take responsibility for trying to address.
There's a TV series in High Flick about this whole topic. I just dropped it in the chat.
Thanks, Noah. Other examples people want to think of like how communities not just verbally try to impose consequences that encourage the stopping of or penitence for harm. Julie, what did you just put in the chat?
Sorry, I'm just going to write it. I put in the link to the movie Get,
Mm.
which is an amazingly troubling movie about.
And like I said, it's all, I always think, you know, when I'm working with my B'nai Mitzvah students and I'm saying like, try to find the message of your Devar Torah, it should never be a message about like how terrible those people are. It should be a message about like some way that our society, our community needs to be doing better. And for progressive Jews to be critiquing Orthodox Jewish community is not critiquing ourselves. So I'm going to say, like, can anyone else think of an example that's more self-critical, or, you know, thinking of ways that our community does or could be or should be working to mitigate harm? Noah and then Anne.
I was thinking when you were talking about how the anti-Semitism is trying to, people in our world are trying to put on to us, all Jewish people, how they feel about whatever's happening with the war. That's one of the ways that we're being called out, but also one of the ways that I am calling out other people, that I guess world events like that get kind of confused. And it becomes a really hot topic, like how to diffuse those situations, because it seems more like at those times it needs diffusing. And when we talked about public apologies, as we're talking about shows, there's a show on Hyflix called The Lesson, and it's got all kinds of layers of this in there. There's a teacher, and his real problem is he called the student fat, but everybody else thinks the problem is that she is against the Arabs because of being harassed while she's swimming. Anyway, it's got all these incredible layers, but he does an amazing public apology, and he still ends up losing his job. But he has to apologize to all of public society, all of Israeli society, for what he said and different things. It's the whole show, all of this whole series is about this. But I think that world events are causing this to come in our faces.
Right. I mean, I think that's a beautiful multi-layered thing to unpack, and I'm not going to try to unpack it all now because we could go down a rabbit hole of talking about the war. But I think broadly, one thing that people in the Jewish community do, and that people in other communities do about Jews, is we conflate the part with the whole and the whole with the part, right? So assuming that all Jews are represented by Israel, that Israel represents all Jews, or assuming that all Palestinians are terrorists, you know, conflating Hamas and Palestinians, and the ways we might then publicly communicate about that on our own social media feeds is something to be very careful to watch, to be watchful of ourselves in this moment. Anne.
Yeah, I'm looking at the book again on page 85. The difference between personal and public relationships, and it feels like that's a really good distinction for me to make in my mind, even in relationship to what you were just saying, where the personal relationships are the intimate bonds between people in the private space, in the realm of work, family, friendship, and so forth. In contrast, public relationships are what we hold in front of each other, with each other. These public relationships are how we model the world we want to live in. This is where the work of accountability for harm becomes particularly important. We have choices to make about how we respond to the harm we scroll past, whether we let it mean something, and whether we let it inform our choices and our actions moving forward. I feel like the public relationships are what we're developing, say, in the Jewish community. And maybe between, it's like these relationships are how we model the world we want to live in. I feel like that's such an interesting statement, or for all nonprofits that I've been in, you know, that usually these nonprofits are idealistic and are wanting to create a certain way of living in the world. And that creates its own halakha, if you will, its own way, if you will. So I just wanted to throw that in there too.
That's beautiful. And it's such a good reminder, right? The way we call people in or out matters as much as for what we call people in or out, especially in a public forum like social media, where what we do is going to last forever and is going to like be shared and ripple out forever. So it reminds me, I don't know how many of you watch my Divrei Torah on Friday nights, but I quoted our longtime member Nadia Telsey a few weeks ago, who said, the means are the ends in the making. And how we get there is what we're going to get when we arrive, right? Like, so if it doesn't matter how abhorrent the thing is that somebody else posts, if we respond to it with an ad hominem attack and call them a miserable excuse for a human being. Because then we are like, what was the quote? That's what we're modeling in the world that we are making. That's the model. We are modeling a world in which people make ad hominem attacks and use abusive language about each other to solve conflict. Like, it does not matter how justified our rage is if we express our rage by increasing harm in the public sphere. Which doesn't either absolve us from doing call outs or mean that people who say terrible things or do terrible things in the public sphere shouldn't be called out. It means that we should try to be creating a better world and a better discourse as we are calling people out. Janine and then Barry.
I'm not sure that this is exactly a right example, but at TBI, I'm thinking about our shared commitment and how that came into being, that certain people felt embarrassed and shamed that they couldn't pay, and that was really looked into, and the culture around paying dues was changed. So it might not fit exactly what we're talking about, but to me, that's in our community of being responsive and making a change.
That's lovely.
I just wanted to reiterate what you said, Rabbi, that how we call people in and or out is as important as what we call them in or out for. And if people haven't heard of it, Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication is, I think, one of the best models I've ever seen for how to express something that is upsetting and that needs to be spoken about or can be spoken about in a way that's respectful of everybody involved.
Thanks, Barry. Do you want to drop his name in the chat so that people can look him up later? Marcia, you are muted, but go ahead.
No, I just thought of something you said when we were doing the interfaith panel, and I can't remember your exact words, but basically what you were saying was that we should recognize that the way we approached problems with an interfaith couple often involved making the Jewish person in the couple comfortable versus looking also at the non-Jewish person's concerns. And do you remember what I'm talking about?
It took me a minute to realize what you meant by the interfaith event, but now I know what you're talking about. Yes.
Okay, sorry. But the panel with the couples and okay. But that's something within our community that I thought was really good to point out, that we were really only looking at one side of the issue, the Jewish side, as opposed to the non-Jewish side of the couple.
And I think that's like a really interesting question. Does a space that is particularist, like a synagogue, like a Jewish community, have an obligation to make it has an obligation to try to welcome everybody, but do we have an obligation to try to make everybody equally comfortable?
Yeah.
And I think this comes back to Julie's question about different modes of harm. If someone who this actually happened a few years ago. There was a Hanukkah event and someone wanted to sing a Christmas song at it. And as rabbi of the community, I said, no, absolutely not. Not at a Hanukkah event in a synagogue. This is one place where Jews come and are going to not have to deal with the Christian hegemony that is surrounding us the rest of the season. The person who wanted to sing the Christmas song was very offended and thought I was being unfair, exclusive, which is also a position I respect. It's a values conflict. And it's a values conflict around how much do particularist spaces have the right to be particularist to the exclusion of other people. And that will cause other people to experience something that feels like harm. And is that something we owe an apology for? Is all harm that is done wrong? Marcia, I'm going to suggest that we give that question a pause and let I love your voice and I want to just see if anyone else wants to say something as we are coming to the close of our time. Okay, go ahead, Marcia.
No, all I was going to say was I think there's a distinction between, non-Jews coming into our synagogue, perhaps as visitors, and non-Jews coming into our synagogue as part of our community, because it's an interfaith couple. I think there's a difference there. That's all.
Right. Thank you. Yes. And I think that speaks to to whom are we accountable, right? We may not be accountable to the non-Jewish person just off the street, but we are certainly accountable to the non-Jewish person who has opted to help create a Jewish home and live a Jewish life and be an ally to this community. And I think that is another good macro question, right? Just like we started the session looking at Queen Elizabeth's apology and seeing all the things we could extrapolate out from that, right? The macro question, we are not all accountable to everyone, but we are all accountable to some people. People who have a public persona are then proportionally greater accountable because they are they have a greater accountability because they are impacting more people. They're accountable to the people, those that they impact. And then we're sort of in this conversation starting to get into the questions of communal institutional accountability, which is next week's chapter. We're going to be talking about institutional obligations. To whom are various institutions accountable? So we're kind of having an early sneak peek segue in. And Jessica wants to say something. So let's hear from you, Jessica.
I can get because I'm part of an interfaith family, and but if you're going to the synagogue for a Hanukkah celebration, you don't bring Christmas into it and say hey, can we sing these Christmas songs? As an interfaith family, they could be going to celebrate Christmas, so then go celebrate Christmas outside the synagogue.
Yes, and that was for sure my perspective.
Yeah.
And I can disagree with the person. I mean, I very clearly disagreed with this person and unapologetically. And that doesn't mean I think they're totally wrong. Yes, Caitlin.
I was gonna say, I think it kind of harkens back to that question of like, is some harm okay sometimes? Right? Like if we're asking in an interfaith family, for example, also in an interfaith family sometimes, I also wouldn't show up and expect my family to sing Christmas songs. But Christmas is a part of my kid's life. And so when they're showing up in their Jewish space, does that mean they have to leave that part of themselves behind? And so we don't love and support all of them because part of it is not a part of this community in the same way. And does that cause harm? I don't know. I guess they'll tell their therapist and then they'll tell me. And then like is that an okay boundary to hold even if it causes harm? And I mean, I don't want to I don't want to litigate this exact question. I totally think what you did was right in the same way that I was deeply moved and spent literally this entire week thinking about the what you said last week about like forgiveness is not a Jewish requirement. I literally have talked to it about like to like 100 people in my life because I was just like mind blown by that. Um, but it's an interesting question. Like, is there an amount of harm that we just accept and don't have to fix, or not? Right? I think I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I think it's an interesting question to interact with. And a little bit harkens back to Julie's question of like, who decides what's harm, right? And like which harm is more worth it or not worth it? Like, would it be more harmful to our bigger to TBI to sing a Christmas song, or is it more harmful to the individual that was hurt? And there's always the trolley problem to interact with about that, but I don't know. I think it's an interesting question as we read the rest of the book to see how organizations handle it. I don't know.
And part of our challenge is we live in in an I hope I would never say to someone something abusive about an idea they have that I disagree with. And I would hope I wouldn't do it publicly. And someone might still be hurt. And we live in a culture, as somebody said earlier, where we're conflating big harms and hurts with little harms and hurts. And we're conflating discomfort with unsafety. And so it all makes all of these questions more murky. It means those of us who have been conditioned to feel very apologetic all the time might feel like we need to run around fixing every hurt we've caused, even when maybe it's not our responsibility. And those of us who have been conditioned to be very defensive might feel that we have grounds to not look into and not fix things that maybe are harms we should try to be more careful about fixing. Julie will have the last comment this evening and then I'll close us.
Well, this is just a little, so I don't know if any of you heard this on NPR. They were talking about teaching mindfulness in elementary schools. And the example they kept using was teaching all the kids to forgive everything. Did like somebody harms you, on the playground, you forgive them. Even if you haven't been asked to forgive them, you forgive them because it will keep your day going better. And I just was listening, just thinking this is so culturally, different from Judaism. Yeah, and it's being presented as this kind of mindfulness, healthy thing for all children in all schools. And I was just like, oh, read the book.
Okay, friends. So I love a conversation in which we end with questions. So we'll end with these questions. What harms do we own unapologetically? Yeah. that hurt you, but I didn't do something wrong? What harms do we need to take responsible for fixing? How far does that accountability extend? To whom are we accountable? And I think those questions will be really great questions for going into our next week's discussion of Chapter 4, Institutional Obligations. It'll get really juicy and maybe it'll get juicy as well. In the meantime, happy Tu B'Shvat. I hope you all hug a tree at some point in the next day.
They need it.
Hugs, Mac, Lila Tove.
Thank
Good
you.
night,
Thanks,
friend.
everybody. See you next week, if not before.